Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's Tuesday again. Obviously, that's why you're here. So, welcome to the next hour of that stuff. Capture One. We're going to spend the next hour editing your pictures, not mine. So you've been good enough to send in lots of cool raws for us to play with. We'll talk about that in a second. But before we get started, we must take a moment, I think, to recognise the huge upset and change that came from the US at the beginning of this week. I mean, talk about momentous occasions. Instagram have changed their feed from being square to being vertical. Now, some people will be disappointed, some people are going to be jubilant. You've got to bear in mind that we're a world of many different people, very, very many different personalities. But one thing to bear in mind is if you had your Instagram layout neatly laid out like a little pattern with multiple different frames because they're all neat and square, have a look. It's not neat anymore. They've done some changes. So that's basically the big news of the week in photographic terms. Couple of new camera little changes and things like that. But anyway, let's move on. Capture One. Let's have a little look at our software. So this is the raw editing software that allows us to process what your camera records onto its little sensor, or big sensor, or tiny sensor, depending on which camera you've got. And we can then play with that data. We can edit, we can process, we can change colors, we can shift contrast, and we'll cover all of that today. And we can hopefully end up with a picture that matches what we remember, because unfortunately for us as human beings, our brains interpret what our eyes see in the way that our cameras don't, which means that the camera recording raw data is literally seeing what your eyes would have received, which is not necessarily the same as what you interpreted. So we use editing software to match, hopefully, what you remember at the time. And that's the whole point. So, before we get started, some ground rules. Number one, no politics today. We're a politics-free zone. Had enough of that today. Number two, we are an absolutely live and interactive session. So please put in questions as we go in the comments. If something goes wrong, if something goes right, if something like our sound goes or whatever, let us know. But check it's not your end first. But more importantly, if we're doing something that doesn't make sense, or you've got a better idea, or you've got another idea, please bung it in the comments and we'll try and talk about it as we go. If you're watching this in the future, so I am now in your past, we didn't do the time travel thing, so I can't really respond, but we can try and answer some of your comments if you put them in there later on. Before we go into the actual software, let's talk about the version. So the current version of Capture One is 16.5.4. You do not have to be on the latest version. It is a service release, so let's just go into here. It's got a few new features, predominantly around AppleScript. Watch this space on that. We might have some funky stuff with AppleScript coming up in the next month or so. Have a look. There's some basically some changes for the Studio Edition, and some of you that use the compare tool to look at a comparison image and then multiple variants. There's some enhancements for that, but most importantly on this one was the adoption of support for Sony's A1 II and Leica's SL3S. Ooh, mouthful. So if you don't have any of that and any need for that, other than the bug fixes around smart adjustments, you don't necessarily have to worry about it, but I would always recommend being on the latest one if you can be. What's also in there, well, not actually as 16.5.4, but at roughly the same time in terms of launch, which was, I think, 5.4 was the 17th. Anyway, on my control panel, this doesn't look good. So on my control panel, I'm about to hit a button that says ass masking. Love a good shortening of words. So, assisted masking, in other words, the ability to select a subject and a background that we've had in the desktop for a little while has finally made it to Capture One mobile. So if you want to delve into that, I know some people have the iPad app, most of you are still on desktop or are on desktop. Have a look on Thursday, I think it is, the 23rd, 4:30 in the UK on Capture One's channel, and you will see, I think David's presenting it. Where is he? There he is. David, I think, is running that one, but they are going to cover the ability to do the same sort of thing, but obviously using touch on your mobile. So layers of masks are getting more and more intelligent, as it were, on Capture One for mobile, which is great news. For those of you that want to send in a picture to be edited, that is where you go. That address, paulreeferlive.wetransfer.com. You can upload your EIP, your RAW, your whatever. Put a little note in there with what you want to have a look at and your name. Most important, if you don't include your name, we will not include your image. Very simple. And fun fact, as of this month, we've started, and it's purely for fun. In our little wee Facebook group, you will find there is now a monthly image competition. Fun, huh? No one wins anything of monetary value, but you do get bragging rights on the first one that we do following that month. So you should go in there and submit if you think you can do better than what's already in there. Right, let's get into Capture One. I'm going to cover... where are we? Charles's question quickly. So, could we provide thoughts on using something like Photoshop on One, Photo Raw, or Luminar Neo for removing distractions? We covered this, Charles. Someone, I'm sure, who's been cataloguing these sessions will find a link, I'm sure. But basically, around December time, I think, maybe November, I actually covered all of the applications that we use on top of Capture One, because it's not just Capture One. If you want to be editing at a pixel level, you are going to need another application, Capture One being the first step, as it were. On One does some great stuff with noise and so on. There are other tools out there that will help you with stacking, like Helicon. But Photoshop's new abilities to remove distractions are fantastic. They are better than most other systems I've seen out there. It can use generative AI, which you want to be careful with, and we'll talk about that in a second, actually, when we go on to another picture. But yeah, so yes, in fact, I'm just going to move that up so we get onto that earlier. Yes, we use all of those tools. Yes, there are limitations to what any RAW editor can do, because generally it's working on the global picture. Although we have layers and masks and so on, to a certain extent, it's still doing bigger stuff than individual tiny little edits at the pixel level, and that's what a pixel editor's for. So I will see if I can find it, and we'll put it in the description thingy later on. Right, yes, Paulie, you do now have a good reason to buy a Leica SL3S. But actually, on a serious point, when you are going to buy a new camera, and we've said this quite a few times before, when you're going to buy a new camera, part of that decision-making process is around not just the camera, but how much will my new batteries cost? How much will my new duplicate charger cost in my wherever I'm going to or whatever? How much will my filters cost if I need to replace them because the lenses are changing? How much will my new memory cards be? How much will my software upgrade be is the question that everyone loves to forget. Please remember it. If you are on a perpetual license for Capture One, you need to check that any new camera purchase is covered by what your perpetual license allows you to upgrade to. If it doesn't, you're going to need to upgrade your software. Do not be surprised that upgrades to software cost money. And I see it all the time. This is why I'm mentioning it. So absolutely, go out and buy the best camera you can get. I would encourage everyone to go and buy new toys all the time. But part of the cost of a new toy is all the peripheral stuff around it. And software is no less of that than your memory cards, your filters, your batteries, everything else like that. So it's not just the camera cost. And I keep seeing this challenge about, why can't I have infinite upgrades to cover every single camera that Capture One don't even know about at the moment? The reason is because they don't know about it. They're not doing it out of spite. And actually, the way that Capture One's engine works is those camera profiles and lens profiles are built into the engine. So it's not like an external catalog or library of profiles and references. It's actually built into the version that you have. So please, for your own sanity, check it all out before you go shopping. Right, we didn't get onto this image last time, a couple of weeks ago. This is from Bart, and it's very similar in terms of the tone and structure. If you look at the last live we did 2 weeks ago, You'll see similar traits in here. You'll see a sunrise or sunset. You'll see a shadow in the foreground, some challenges in the middle, and some work that's been done. And I'm probably going to undo a lot of that work. So here is the before. So press Y on your keyboard and you will get a lovely before and after slider. If you don't see the slider up here on your before and after, it's probably because you've got full view selected. So don't do that. Oh, fun little top tip, because it's annoying me that I keep forgetting to let you guys know. When you're brushing with the AI brush specifically, you get this little helper that tells you the bit that you're about to select. That's the AI brush. Great. So in this case, the boat. And then I'll go and do something. So I'll go on to another image or whatever else, and I'll maybe go on to another layer, and then I go on to here, and oh, it's annoying, right? Because it keeps the AI brush, so it keeps with this selection thing as I'm moving my mouse around. Just press V with your finger. V for move. But the V button on your keyboard at any point in time with whatever you're doing in Capture One will get you back to the standard select arrow pointer. Likewise, if you hold down the space bar with your finger, you will get a hand that you can then move things around, regardless of what you're doing in Capture One. Or you can press the H key and you get to hand. But the point being, let's imagine I was in my AI brush doing something. Let's go into here. So I'm playing with my AI brush and I want to move the view of this image around. Just press the space bar. It doesn't matter what I'm doing. Temporarily, it switches me to my hand. When I let go of the space bar, I'm back to the same tool that I was in before, whatever that tool was. Same with Healing Brush. So Healing Brush, I'm doing stuff here, press the space bar. Now I can move things around, let go of the space bar, I'm back to my Healing Brush. It should be really, 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 like that needs to almost become innate in you. It'll speed up your editing so much if you can get into your head this quick sort of spacebar move around, edit, move around, edit, move around, edit without having to switch tools. It's really handy. Anyway, so what are we going to do with this? Well, let's look at what I'm seeing first. And as always, I haven't spent hours looking at this. We probably put these in about an hour ago. So what I first see in this image, even without the before and after, is a green sky. And granted, in theory, look up at these numbers. So these numbers, the readout, are always going to tell you what the red, green, and blue values are, unless you switch to a different readout. And also the luminosity. So this area here, 182 red, 179 green, 129 blue, 174 is the overall brightness, the average of those values, if you wish. Yes, Keith, another muscle memory activity to remember. Make a list. I'm limited. I think I'm going to limit my muscle memory things in future to about 8, but that one will be in there because it just saves so much time. So if I look at these values along here, they all sort of make sense because it should be. So if you think about a golden hour sky, well, it's sort of, it's going to be warm, right? It's going to be yellowish. There might be a little bit of blue in there from the natural sky. However, you know, it's going to look a little bit warmer. Now, a little bit warmer than blue is probably a little bit greeny looking. And if I look at this and look at those values, so 160 red, 158 green, red and green when they're additive colors are going to make yellow, effectively, and 102 blue. So you've got a low end, like residual amount of blue, and then over the top you've got some extra green and extra red, which is making that blue slightly yellowish. The problem is that I'm not getting yellow here. Visually, I'm seeing green, and no one wants a green sky. So, and actually there's a way that I can just check this. At any point in time, if you want to see what the real color is, the actual color that's there, not your perceptive or perceptual color, if you want, just create a new layer. It doesn't really matter because we're going to delete it anyway. Go to your advanced color editor, pick on your little pipette, and click. And that gets rid of any doubt. So colors are colors. The red, green, and blue at the top, you can interpret and you can say, oh, it's a bit yellow, a bit green, a bit blue. If I click on an area in here, this will tell me exactly where that color sits. And in this case, it is yellow, but it's heading towards that little green part of the fan. And if I start clicking around, you'll see it sort of shifts. And the further up the sky I go, you see the more green it is. And this color here, that's not a sky color. Just saying. I mean, yes, the sky could be green, but I think something else is going on at the point that that happens. And if I look at the original, before and after, or Y on the keyboard, that ain't green. So, yes, absolutely, we can use our raw processor to color correct, but I would hope that it corrects rather than puts in something that wasn't really right. And if I look at the layers that are on here from Bart, one of them is Sky More Blue. And what's interesting is there's a selection here on the sky, which is, we've chosen that selection, kind of like I did. There is a mask, I think, yet only on the sky. Interestingly, not on this area here. So we probably need to fill that in a little bit if we are going to use that layer. But what's happened is it's shifted. There's a hue shift to actually make the sky go more towards blue. Now, here's the problem. If I'm on yellow and I want to shift my hue, I've got two ways I can go. And if I wanted, the problem being blue is opposite to yellow, right? Almost. So if I want to make it go more blue, there's two ways around this wheel. And if I push the hue to the right, it brings it around this way to the wheel. The way to check this, if ever you're sort of thinking, oh, what way is it going? Put the saturation of your output up. And you'll see if I go back to 0, so it was the yellows. If I go this way around, it's going around the green side to get to blue. If I go this way around, it's going around the orange and red side, around the top, to get to blue. The problem is, if the goal was to make it more blue, a 30-degree shift in hue is never going to get there. So we've actually got a layer that's not making the sky more blue, it's making the sky more green, because it's going this way around that color wheel. And that's not what we wanted. So you've actually got a destructive layer in there. And on top of that, we haven't shifted. So here's my original, the custom white balance, 4887, minus 3.6, whatever those are. I'm happy with that. That's your choice. The place to make the sky more blue would have possibly been in the white balance rather than in the color editor. So I'm going to, in fact, let's just clone this variant so we don't alter too much. We've got something to compare. So in this case, I'm going to reset this back to roughly where it was. I think that was about it. So this is our original. Here's the one that I'm going to edit. I'm going to undo this color edit because it doesn't make sense to me. And instead, I'm going to use our white balance. Now, if I go cooler, there's my blue. Or if I go warmer, we go more into the golden hour. And I would argue in this case that I probably want to go warmer a little bit. And if we have got any green tint in here, well, clues in what I just said, tint, we can move that up a little bit just to neutralize it. And now I've got a much more natural looking sky. Now, there's other bits that we need to have a look at, but overall, if I compare this sky to that sky, this is much more fitting with that scene. And I think there is generally a problem, which is we forget that the scene has to work. I can look at the individual elements. I can say the sky should be blue, the water should be bluey green, this hill should be brown. But overall, I'm taking the light that came from whatever was there in the scene, and I'm applying it to the overall image. So it can't just be those individual pieces in isolation. You've got to look at the overall scene and what really works. So I'd be in a place of, in fact, I'm going to push that a little bit more warm and a little bit more tinted. I'm just to be pedantic, I'm not a fan of the fact that you can see here, if you look very closely, because that mask finished, we've got our tint change here, and then it subtly, but it's still there, stops. And the reason being because the mask stopped. So I'm going to go into my AI brush and try and grab these bits, which should work. Yep, there we go. So just like we talked about for the last couple of weeks, this AI brush masking stuff, in fact, I don't care if I get that structure. That doesn't bother me. If I don't want the structure, now I've got everything behind it. You can probably guess what I'm going to use, but we'll go through it anyway. I can go to my magic eraser, say, make sure that I'm not sampling the entire photo, really low tolerance, and I'm going to click on that structure, and it should help me by taking it out, because anything similar to what I'm clicking on should go. If it's not getting everything I want, just bump that tolerance up a little bit, not too much, and it should start getting more of the structure. The tiny little sort of pin width pieces I'm not too worried about. To make this more subtle and more believable, I'm going to go to a grayscale mask, so Option and M, or click up here, display grayscale mask, and I'm going to refine that sky mask by a little bit. So if I go from there, that was where we were, a bit messy. The refine tool will get us to a much smoother mask, so I won't notice where that's gone on. And now I don't have that break in the color. So to me, that's sort of where I'd be with the sky. Personally, I would actually go a little bit further, to be honest. I've got the room up here to do it, so we could just warm up a little bit more and add a bit more tint in. We might darken that top bit in a minute, but we've got another thing to fix first. So the bid in the foreground, the healing, Bart, no issue with that. You had a question about the boat. To be honest, if the boat was part of the scene, you're not going to replace that with something that the computer's made up. You can do, but if you do, I don't know what it's going to dream up was maybe behind it. We don't know. So I think it's risky to start playing that game. You could lower its contrast, but that's your call. What I would do, however, is bring up this foreground a little bit more, fix this bit here because there's a little bit of a glow, and undo this. We'll talk about that in a second. So foreground first. Let's create, and yes, George, the people do not use the grayscale mask enough. It is so good when you can see exactly what objects are included in the mask. Yeah, a lot of time savers, some of these things. Right, let's create a layer called foreground. I'm going to use my AI mask and say all of this. Could try the subject mask, but I don't think that person is going to be necessarily the subject. Let's turn our mask on with the M key to make sure what it's got. It's got most of it, didn't get the legs. So if it didn't, well, we go old school. We go magic brush. And we get magic brush to do stuff. Perfect. Grayscale mask, check that we're good. Now there's a couple of bits of the water we can see here that it's got in red. It just looks like maybe some shadow in there. So I'm just going to go to a regular eraser. Doesn't need to be particularly smart or clever. And then we're going to get rid of that. I'm going to do it messily because when I've finished, I'm going to go to refine and allow Capture One to tidy up that edge. Great. With that, exposure up just a little bit. Not a huge. I'm not going to go to there. A, that looks stupid, but B, oh, you're dragging up noise and horrible gunk and whatever else as a result of it. So don't push your camera's data too far. But we can certainly get out of this sort of complete darkness. When you print this, this is going to be really dark. There, at least, I've got some shape in the shadows. That just feels a bit better. Up here, who was it mentioned? So Keith, wouldn't the issue with trying to recover the boat be bending light in an unnatural, impossible way? Yeah, it would a little bit. So the reason we're able to get away with this foreground is I can perceive that this light would have hit this and reflected back to me. Because this is head on to us and in the reverse of the sun, I think if we do light up the boat, it is going to look completely fake. So where I would be is, let me just check something actually. Okay. Where I would be is we do add another layer in if we are going to tackle the boat, but we actually take more than the boat. We take the whole area of this jetty, including that bit in the middle, which will not play ball. So there we go. I'm going to refine it again a little bit, just because I'm being fussy. And I'm going to pull the contrast down. And I'm going to pull the exposure down a little bit as well. So what that does is effectively it flattens the difference between the bright part and the dark part. It's not really even actually much of a bright part in there. Actually, that's a point. If anything, contrast isn't going to help us. Contrast is going to look for the highlights and the shadows, and it's going to push them further apart. This area up here is all pretty much in shadow. We've got some slightly bright shadows and some slightly dark shadows. So instead of doing it that way, we're going to do it in a luma curve. So we're going to leave the darkest parts where they are, placing a little anchor point. And then I'm going to darken down the other bits. There, you see that side of that boat starting to disappear? So this is like the opposite, I guess, of a contrast tool, because it's not really doing much to the higher end, but it is darkening the lower end. This is purely your call, though. If we don't like that, then if you want to make the boat a feature, there it is. I wouldn't leave this bit as part of that group, but yeah, this is purely down to your call, what you want to see more of or less than. This as a silhouette to me works fine. It makes sense with the light. Okay, this bit out here. So we've got a weird bit where we're obviously getting a bit of a bounce through the lens, so we're getting a reflection here, a little disc. And it's basically changing the color. So we go to sort of 102, 86, 74, so slightly red, reddy yellowish. Across to here, the sea is naturally actually grey, believe it or not. So 91, 96, 91. There will be some bluer parts, so maybe there aren't. Maybe yellowish parts. Yeah, there you go. So you've got a difference in color between these two, but this is really easy to fix. So we're going to create a new layer, and we're going to call it Sunspot. And I'm going to, what are we going to do? I'm going to paint really rough over here. Okay, really rough. Go into my color editor under skin tone, and I'm going to say I want this color. But I want the skin tone tool to also include all of this color up here as well. And I'm going to say I want you to start making it uniform in color. You see, this is shifted too much, funnily enough. So we're just going to come back a little bit there. And we're going to increase our saturation a little bit. We can change our hue. Where are we going? We're going back towards blue from this position here. So this way around the wheel. Lower our lightness a little bit. And then we're just going to make it more uniform. So it's subtle, I'll give you that. But just going to move that dot to be slightly more blue. There we go. So if I turn this layer off, you see, hopefully you see that's quite red. Turn it on, and it goes less red. It's not fixing it completely, it goes less red. I'm not a fan of how green that's gone, to be honest. So we're going to shift this and say, no, I do want it to be that bluey color there. And we can tweak this more and more. It's genuinely your call, but you've got the ability to play with how uniform you want this entire section that we drew here to be. Now, yeah, I'm still not a fan of that. Still don't like that. I like that it's not quite so red, but we have gone a little bit horribly green. So let's maybe back away that hue shift and just play with the uniformity to try and get that. Now, this stuff here is now too much. I get that. So we're going to go to our eraser, really soft brush. I'm literally just erasing out some of this. This is going to be a bit weird what I do next. We're going to refine the mask, and I'm going to refine it maximum amount, which gives me a mask which spreads over that sunspot. And we're using Capture One to do it all. So we're not having to be clever, we're not having to be particularly careful with masking. Just need to add in a bit there. The problem is I'm still not quite happy with it. And I wonder if we can get somewhere more neutral like that. Maybe that's better. Maybe. That's to grab too much. So all I'm doing is I'm finding the little, literally, sweet spot where it's neutral enough that we don't notice the shift. There we go. But if I go from there, which is red, to there, which is green, and if I don't like how much it shifted, remember it's on a layer, so I can back away the opacity. And then all of a sudden we've got a neutral spot, which is what I was hoping for. Paul, if it's almost grey, couldn't desaturation do the trick? Ish. The problem is it's not actually almost grey, is it? It's grey with hints of colour. If I do pull down desaturation, you're probably going to see it a bit more. A little, yeah. We can probably push it to about halfway. Helps. Yep. Good shout. Given that these readings up here, now what you will have lost in doing that, if we look up close, if there were little flecks of colour, they'll have gone. Well, they'll have half gone. But it may, yeah, it may work. We can also pull down a little bit of brightness as well. Tim, the flare didn't bother me all that much. Well, I won't bother. No, to be honest, as I say, these are small things that I'm just, as we work around that image, there are things that we can play with and things that we can't. I'm just going to back that away a tiny little bit. The bit that worries me most is this one. So if I look at the original, I actually quite like this orb. Now the temptation, we all have it, the temptation to get that sun clear, crystal clear. But the problem in doing that is we end up with these layers of sort of onion skin around it, and very harsh lines around that sunset or sunrise. The Pro Standard profiles will help with that. I'm going to guess, yeah, this has it on, because the generic one would have looked more yellow. But this comes from trying to use the HDR sliders to completely recover. So if I go back to my main image layer, there we are, white, minus 100. And if I had it to 0, there's our original sun flare. I get the temptation that we all have to try and get the detail back. But this sun was diffused. So you can see that even with the complete recovery. At f8 on a 40mm lens, if the sun was a nice, clean, crisp point of light, you would have just got a pure starburst. You wouldn't have seen this. So this has been diffused through some sort of moisture in the air. This, therefore, just looks a little bit inaccurate. So what I'd be tempted to do is just pull that down. And if you want to leave a bit of the orb, okay, fine. But that's, if we don't like that, then pull it back a bit. But I wouldn't be pulling it to there. It just looks wrong. I'd pull it maybe to there. In fact, I'd be tempted to make it glow more, but that's a different thing. What we can do in here, if we want, we could draw a very, very, very soft radial mask. So like this, that being up here on the toolbar. And with my radial mask, I can say, actually what I want to do is just pull down that exposure a touch. And what that's going to do is it's going to pull it down in the middle and then fade it out as it gets further away from that middle by me stretching the transition point to be massive, effectively. So with that pulled down, I could also pull up a little bit of saturation. I could pull up a little bit of warmth. I could pull up a little bit of tint. And you see the point. We can start tweaking how that sun looks, but it needs to remain looking natural. Good point, Keith. So we love the exposure warning because it tells us when one or more channels is clipped. Not necessarily white. It could be the red channels clipped, the green, blue, whatever. My exposure warning is going to tell me, ooh, this is horrible. If I look at the other edit, we've got all the exposure warning fixed. Great. But it looks wrong. If you're shooting directly into the sun, and I recall an argument actually I had. It was with a panel with the Royal Photographic Society, and it was about city lights at night. And their argument to me was that there is a flaw in this picture because your highlights are overexposed. And I pointed out that this picture is looking directly into about 180 spotlights. The spotlights were the feature of the city. If I were to not overexpose them, if I were to get them back down by putting basically a welder's mask on the front of my camera, for the spotlights to be completely visible and I could maybe see the filament in the light itself, what else am I going to see in that scene? And that's crazy. So we have a great dynamic range in our eyes. We've got a better dynamic range than most cameras. But still, if you look at the sun, it is still going to be blown out compared to anything else in that shot. So it's okay. I'm telling you now, it's okay. If you have a picture directly into the sun, it is likely that you're going to get a slight overexposure. And that's okay. You're pointing it at a huge molten boiling orb of gas that gives us heat and light and all the other stuff that if we got any closer in the universe to it, we would all fry. Therefore, it makes sense that sometimes it might peak and it might give us one of these little nasty exposure warnings. If I look at the exposure warning, so you'd think, oh my God, all of this area is overexposed. It is in one or more channels. Here, I grant you, look at the numbers up here. 255 is our maximum. 255, 255, 255, 255. It was overexposed when we captured it. It cannot be recovered. Even if it was recovered so that the exposure warning goes away, this is now 251, but it's still no detail because all we've done is recovered stuff that was at, say, 400, and we brought it down within the exposure warning area, so it's no longer telling us that it's over. But there's no detail in there. Let's have a look. There's nothing in there. So whether it's a little bit overexposed or a lot overexposed, the amount of detail in this orb is no different. The difference for me is that one of these looks believable as a sun pointing directly at it, and one of them just looks overworked. So go beyond that. Outside of the sun itself, look out here. The reason you're getting the exposure warning out there is because the red channel, you can see at the top, says 255. So in other words, the red channel has clipped. That's okay. It's not okay. And don't get me wrong, in a perfect world, the sun would be controllable. We would have a little remote control. Wonderful. But we don't have that. So the red channel is overexposed. The green is not. The blue is not. There's still data in the blue channel, still data in the green channel, which is why you're getting this slightly yellowy, reddy sort of color here. If it were me in my shot here, I would be back down here and I would be undoing even more of that white recovery. If you want to get more of the overall recovery, maybe do the highlights, but I would do it selectively on that little orb that we've just done. So I can pull the highlights in a little bit. There we go. But I wouldn't go any further than that. And then finally, just name your layers, always remember them. In fact, be very specific, otherwise you're going to get confused between sun orb and sunspot on water. Talked about that just now, but I would be tempted just to put a slight, make sure you're on your new layer when you start drawing, a slight, very slight graduated filter here. And with that filter, I pull down the exposure a little bit. It's going to go murky. So we're going to then pull up our saturation a little bit. And you'll see that we go from this, getting lighter as it goes out of the print, to this where it's getting darker. And we could also then push that tint a little bit more with that layer. Let's just see what we had on the sky. Where are we? 58237.5. So we need to be more than that. So 5823, so we're going to go to maybe there. And that's where I would end up. Now, is it a great print? That's up to you, but in terms of whether you want the ship in there or whatever else. But those little tweaks take us from here with a weird green sky, an over-processed sun, and not enough detail in the foreground to there, which just feels so much more natural to my eyes. I wasn't there. If that was genuinely what you recall, stick with it. But my gut feel is that's going to look a bit nicer on the wall. Keith's point, is this an opportunity where bracketing the exposure? You could do an HDR exposure, one exposure for the sun and the highlights, one exposure for the midtones, one exposure for the shadows. My gut feel on this, let's look at our histogram. I've got a huge spike here, a huge spike in the midtones, and a huge spike in the shadow. If I blend that, I think you're going to end up with something very similar to that. Maybe not quite that much, maybe there. And again, I'd still come back to, so this would be a big, it's not, but it could be almost the equivalent of an HDR bracketed version. I'd still say that's the more natural shot. That just feels more like what your eye would have seen. This feels impossible, and this one just feels wrong. Paul, can we apply the rule of the sun to the lights in the Christmas markets, which sometimes overexpose? Yes. If you're pointing your camera directly at a light source, it's funny, we call them specular highlights quite often, but we're talking about tiny little light sources which aren't the overall exposure in the image. They're reflections of things or tiny little like fairy light elements. It's okay for them to blow. And in fact, here's a perfect example. These bits here are blown, right? They're overexposed. If I turn on my exposure warning, we get these here. They're called specular highlights. They're little incidental bits of light that don't necessarily detract from the main light source, but they do have an impact on the image because they're picking up detail. Now in this image here, even though the whites were completely recovered, you still can't fix the fact that this stuff here is just super blown. Can't do anything with it. So if we're happy with that, it would make sense surely that I'd be happy with the single light source I'm pointing directly at to also be slightly blown. But anyway, yeah, so that's our starting point. In fact, our starting point, let's just go raw, was there. And I put it to you, jury, that our edit at the top is a lot more sympathetic. Well, I can't really do it this way. To the original than the edit at the bottom. And if I look at the color toning, we've actually warmed it a little bit. But the one at the top has got a lot more detail in the foreground, but it's got a lot more sympathetic sky than the one at the bottom. It just feels like it's gone a bit too far. Right, let's get blasting on some other stuff. Alan sent in a fun one, so a fun debate point on this one. Alan is sending this into a nature competition, and the challenge with the nature competition is you can't heal anything out. There are certain rules, and I don't know which one you're putting it into, Alan, so it's a bit more difficult to deal with. But in general, in nature competitions, you can edit exposure, you can edit contrast, you can edit saturation levels and so on, as long as it's sympathetic. There's certain wording they use. If I look at the Nature Photographer of the Year stuff, they do not allow healing or cloning. They do allow bracketed shots, which is an interesting little fun one. But they want you to keep it as natural as possible, and any selective work should be limited to getting it back to looking natural. So the question that we got from Alan is, how do I get rid of these stripes because they're distracting in the background without using the healing tool? And the quick answer obviously is we'll use the healing tool. But I think there's probably a slightly better way of doing this, a bit more subtle. So this is Alan's existing edit. Here's the original. There's a new one. It's a nice edit. When it comes to this stuff, I feel they're going to want a bit more sharpness in there, Alan. But I don't know who's judging or whatever. But certainly in terms of this leaf here, because it's quite prominent, I'd maybe up the structure a little bit, because this bit isn't included in there. So, for example, if I were to draw a new mask just around there, and then pull up structure, you see this difference in here? From there, slightly blurry, to there, a lot more detail. Don't push it too far. The stuff that's coming towards the camera is naturally falling out of the depth of field, but you could maybe improve that bit a little. Now, the rest of it, the background. These green things, I'm giving you a clue, these green things are really annoying because they add extra stripes and stuff in the background. And this bit here, maybe. And Alan was trying dodging and burning, but I would be in a place of playing with it a little bit. You'll be very careful with this. So I just seen a question. So George, I heard somewhere that pixels at 255, 255, 255 are a problem when printing. Well, your printer will love you for it. So they're not a problem for printing because it means that they don't have to spend any amount of money on any ink because the printer is not going to lay any ink down. The reason that people say it's a problem is because you can see the paper through it. So it's not what you necessarily think. If you print solid black and solid white, you don't print solid white, but if you print solid nothing onto certain, and it is very specific, certain fine art papers, when you look across the paper, you'll see almost what looks like puddles. You'll see a dark patch where it's solid black, and you might see a scratchy patch where there's been no ink laid down onto the paper, where it's completely white. So people will refer to that as a problem. It's your call. If you want to make sure that you never see a completely white patch on the paper, then make sure your highest value for anywhere on the image is 253-ish, I guess. You're going to get at least some dots laid down. But at that point, I would question, if it's overblown, it's overblown. So these things here, we cannot heal them out, but what we could do is we could use a color range and subtly make some changes. So I'm going to go to my advanced color tool on my background layer. At the moment, I've got no mask on the background. Let's try. Not bad. Little magic background button, kind of like the new iPad update. So it's picked out our background, great. And I'm now going to choose the green color in here. And with that color, only that color, I'm just going to pull the saturation down a touch, and you are allowed to change saturation in this tone. Pull the lightness down a touch. Hue, be careful with changing. You could go more blue. So remember, this direction, it's a bit confusing, but to the right is going to go this way, to the left is going to go that way. So if we want this to blend in more with the background, we want it to go more out into the yellows, so we're going to go this way around. Not too much, although that would actually, that would fix it to a certain extent. In fact, let's just pull that lightness down. No, we'll leave it where it was. The smoothness of that color, so in other words, the bits that are included in my mask and the bits that aren't, I'm going to increase. If I want to see just the color range I'm choosing, we can see it there. Now remember, your color range within your color editor is going to pick up everything on the image that you're seeing, including this bit here. You can see that's included. But because we have a mask on, although it is picking up this color here, it's not included in my mask, so this is having no effect on this stuff in the middle. But then we would go from there to there. Now, if that's enough, I don't know, Alan, to be honest. But you are quite limited when it comes to nature stuff. It's a challenge. Like it's a real challenge because you are supposed to be presenting what was physically there, and that's why they don't allow you to heal things out and so on. But I would say that's possibly slightly less or more separated than this one. Whether it works or not, that's a different thing. You can change white balance in your nature image. So if I were to pick on the background and go maybe to there, maybe a bit of that, and then personally, I'd be tempted to do a global one of those. So I go from there to there. I think this is probably, this actually feels quite soft, quite natural. But that sort of starts ticking the box to me. Lockfee, so this is where we get into a challenge. I don't know, Alan, whether you're allowed to use clarity. Clarity is a form of contrast and sharpening, which would be included in the allowed list. But some people might get itchy about it. So if we were to pull down clarity on this layer, you can see more obvious, less obvious, more obvious, less obvious. So on this layer, specifically, remember on the background layer, we are only touching the things that are not your focal point. Pulling down clarity and maybe down a little bit of structure would also help soften it. and I then get from there to there. Whether that's what you need, I don't know, right? Because I don't know the rules of what you put in, but in theory, we haven't broken any of the rules. Certainly the ones around the nature categories out there. It is subtle. It is sensitive to the area. It's not using healing. It's not using cloning. It's not using selective color, which is a very specific tool. We are selecting areas and doing contrast changes and color changes and saturation changes, which is slightly different. But yeah, this becomes a minefield on rules. Have a look at your rules, see what you can do. But if the only issue was you couldn't heal or clone, this one on the right would tick that box, and the background is a lot less obvious, for sure. Georg. Funky trees. I like trees at the moment. We're big into trees at the moment. I don't like trees that have nuclear moss, though. And I think that's where we're at here. So I love when we get into forests and stuff, the textures and all the colors and all the different tones and everything. I would say in this case, it's possibly been pushed a little bit too far. The reason I can know that is if I go back to my original. Actually, I'll show you properly. So, a couple of layers in here. One is removing the fence post, which is this bit down the back. So, good call. Your choice, whether you want to leave it in or not. Has it gone from there as well? Yep. So, we've got a layer that's doing a few different things, just getting rid of the signs of human existence. And then a layer up here that darkens that sky down from overexposed to something else. But if I were to reset all my adjustments, because I thought originally this is just because it's been lifted with exposure. Let me just lift this exposure of this shot up. You see how it naturally increases. And actually, as you bring up exposure, sometimes you get the effect of almost washing out some of the colors because you're raising the levels up closer and closer and closer to white. So it's not about its brightness, but this has just been so heavily pushed in terms of its color that it just starts to feel a little bit overdone. Now, the saturation here at 28 isn't the only thing. So if I undo that, you see, we've still got, so undo, redo, undo, redo. By the way to do that, you're clicking with a mouse on the name of the tool temporarily. Click and hold, it will undo it temporarily, let go, and it will reset the slider. But we can see from this, it's not just the saturation. So it's not just that saturation slider. Something else is going on. Some of it may be levels, but we could use the option key now for the overall tool. So without, with, without, with. It's brightening, but it's not necessarily changing color levels. So it's not that either. Could it be an RGB curve? Nope, nothing in there. Could it be an advanced color editor? No. Could it be in our basic tab? Nope. Skin tone tool? Nope. So where's it coming from? And this is one that it's interesting. Many years ago, we didn't have Dehaze, if you remember. Now, this is, just to be clear, it's not all coming from the Dehaze tool. This is a compound effect of lots of different things. But the Dehaze tool does a lot of different things in one go. It's got a bit of contrast in there, a bit of clarity in there, and it also adjusts the colors. And it's doing it by way of removing your shadow tone, as they call it. Now, the problem with removing a neutral shadow tone, in this case, this gray, is by taking that out of what was there before, I enhanced the remaining color that was there, which is green. So, for example, and I can prove this, if I were to click and tell it the shadow tone was green, it's now going to remove that from everything else. You can go nuts with the Dehaze tool, but the problem is that it's doing more than one thing. It's also affecting saturation. So if I have a Dehaze and a clarity and a saturation and a contrast, and potentially even a color editor, you're pushing things too far because all of those things compound to make something that's a bit over the top. So I'm going to back away our Dehaze tool. In fact, if it was me, I'd be tempted to add a bit of haze not too much, but we're going to back it away anyway. We're also going to pick on these mid-tones here, and I know they're mid-tones because as I move around, we get these sort of, they tend to go up into the hundreds and so, 115, 140 and so on. So these mid-tones, I'm just going to let's just make them a little bluer. And the same with the shadows, I'm just going to push them to be a little bit bluer. The highlights, I want to bring to be a bit warmer, just to experiment. Okay. Where are we? Our blacks have been lifted there. So I'm going to pull down that saturation for sure. Not completely, but maybe to about there. Contrast is good. We can actually up that. Most of this tree, and you can see in the histogram, sits in the shadow. So here's the weird bit. By upping contrast, yes, you do increase the highlights, but you are very much darkening the rest of the scene. I like that. Maybe not quite that much, maybe to about there, but that's good. Okay. And then I'd almost be tempted to sort of split tone this a little bit. We don't have any color editor in here. Nothing that's doing anything clever anyway. But we could, well, I'm not going to do it in there actually. We'll do it in the color balance tool. Let's just turn off black and white. I already sort of did it here with the difference between the shadows and the highlights. But I'm going to actually stretch it more. We're going to go shadows even bluer. Mid-tones to match. Highlights to be out here. In fact, let's just make sure they are blue and not pinky blue. Going into sort of there. And then overall, I wonder if I can get away with just not saturating at all. Maybe even on that dehaze, just pulling that down almost completely. Yeah. Now, George, you've already got a, sorry, Georg, you've already got a vignette in there. Maybe we flatten that out a little bit. Clarity I'm good with. Structure I would add a bit more in because I really, really want, and notice we're doing this on the image layer, I really want to pull out all that texture in that moss. Because these changes have been made on the image layer, if I wanted to back any of them away, I've now got a problem. I have to do it individually, but I don't. I can right click, go to move image layer adjustments to a new layer. The one it's not going to move is the vignette because that's across the board, but I now have what we'll call global adjustments. And that means that I can actually back this away. I can go back to original and then up to the edits and anywhere in between. So I'm going to back this away to about there. And to me, this is the key thing. I don't want to change this that much. Just going back to Alan's just now, the challenge with nature is don't mess with it. General rule for humans, maybe. But let's say I did want to pick on this particular green here. Let's go into my basic color editor. I'm going to pick on this really saturated green there. And I'm going to say I'm going to shift that green to be a little bluer. Maybe, well, do we go maybe there? Maybe there. So a little more yellow, a little less saturation over start, and maybe a little less brightness. I'm just softening. So if I now go before and after, you can see we've lit it up effectively. In fact, I'm just going to pull up our white balance a tiny bit as well to there. So we've lifted the image, but we haven't altered the actual tones, the richness, the saturation of it. Whereas here, you see now how much of a difference that now feels. From there, it feels very natural. There, ooh, that hurts my eyes a little bit. So that's all it is, Georg. Honestly, it's a wonderful shot. I love the tree shots. I love it, especially when they're coming out towards you. You've got a decent set of sharpness on here all the way through here. It's sharp front to back. You've got a bit of work out here to maybe do. This luma range I don't think is helping you. We talked about this a couple of weeks ago, but with that luma range, you see you've got this weird pattern going on. So if you are going to do it with the luma range, make sure you've got a very soft fall off and make sure you're only getting the bits that you want, which is the sky. Put a bit of radius on there and you'll make those patterns disappear a little bit. Even with that, I would personally rasterize that mask, go to refine, So let's just go to a grayscale mask. You see how binary that is? Go to refine. Refine it, or refine the hell out of it, basically. And you see now how much better or nicer that mask now feels. And we'll have the same issue here. So we just rasterize that, refine it completely. Oh, sorry. That was global adjustment. That was silly. There. So it's on this one. So we're going to rasterize. In fact, we're going to go to Luma range first. We're going to make that adjustment. So I'm going to back it away to only pick up the sky. Soft fall off. Nice bit of radius. Now rasterize. Now refine. And I've got my detail back, which is more important. Keith, does it matter when you create a global adjustment layer within the workflow? Not really, because these are all one doesn't act on the other, if you see what I mean. They all work independently. Healing can get confusing if you start doing it above and below, because if you've got a mask for the healing, you can end up then with bits of your adjustments not affecting what's not in that mask. But generally speaking, I'd try and do the global stuff first if you can. But in terms of this image, Georg, it's a wonderful image, but don't push it that far. Try and get it to here. And if I look at the comparison of before and after, this one at the top just looks too much of a stretch from before. This one just looks like we've lit it up a little bit. And that, to me, is a nice way to represent that tree. If you do want to lift it a bit more, go to our global adjustments. We could lift up brightness a touch. I wouldn't lift up exposure because that's going to push your highlights up here out again. But I would be in a place of lifting brightness a touch if you wanted to, but no more. And otherwise, I'm just tweaking now, but it's nice. It's a lovely tree, but don't push it nuclear. We're not yet at this point in the world where the trees are going to be that color. They may be soon. But this is that feels like a forest, so I'd leave it there. Right, next session, couple of weeks, we're going to pick on Richard's shot of a bird to start with, but for today, so lots of stuff I think we've covered in terms of masking and certainly color edit, which is fun. Alan, hopefully clarity and a little bit of a selective reduction in color will help you with that stuff, but check the rules, genuinely check the rules. But no issue with that shot. The ferry isn't actually as much of a problem as you possibly think, but I wouldn't push things this far, and just keep an eye on the colors being real. And actually that's what it is. So here I want the colors to feel real. Here, genuinely in a nature shot, as long as the colors feel real, I'm okay with it. Here, those colors need to feel real. They cannot be like that. And that's probably a good place to stop, isn't it? Yeah. So between now and next time, which is going to be, I'm looking at a calendar, the 4th of February, 2 weeks time, get your competition stuff into there. That'll be fun, because we'll announce it next week, 2 weeks time. In the meantime, between now and then, you've got access to the masterclasses that we built, so you can learn individual subjects if you so wish. Don't forget you've got the the assisted masking session with David and the Capture One team on Thursday. They will cover the iPad app and all the new toys that went into the latest version for that. Between now and then, you can contact us, but you can also contact each other through those means, and we'll see you then. Cheers, everyone. Bye-bye.